Volume 1, Chapters 1 and 2 of The Widow Barnaby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Céline Major. The Widow Barnaby by Francis Milton Trollope. 1. Introduction to the family of the future Mrs. Barnaby. Financial difficulties. Maternal love. Preparations for a fête. Miss Martha Compton and Miss Sophia Compton were, some 25 years ago, the leading beauties of the pretty town of Silverton in Devonshire. The elder of these ladies is the person I propose to present to my readers as the heroine of my story; but ere she is placed before them in the station assigned her in my title page, it will be necessary to give some slight sketch of her early youth, and also such brief notice of her family as may suffice to make the subsequent events of her life, and the persons connected with them, more clearly understood. The Reverend Josiah Compton, the father of my heroine and her sister, was an exceedingly worthy man, though more distinguished for the imperturbable tranquillity of his temper, than either for the brilliance of his talents or the profundity of his learning. He was the son of a small landed proprietor at no great distance from Silverton, who farmed his own long-descended patrimony of 300 acres with skilful and unwearied industry, and whose chief ambition in life had been to see his only son Josiah privileged to assume the prefix of Reverend before his name. After 3 trials and 2 failures, this blessing was at last accorded, and his son ordained by the help of a very good-natured examining chaplain of the then Bishop of Exeter. This rustic, laborious, and very happy squire lived to see his son installed curate of Silverton, and blessed with the hand of the dashing Miss Martha Wisett, who, if her pedigree was not of such respectable antiquity as that of her bridegroom, had the glory of being accounted the handsomest girl at the Silverton balls; and if her race could not count themselves among the landed gentry, she enjoyed all the consideration that a fortune of £1,000 could give, to atone for any mortification which the accident of having a ci-devant tallow chandler for a parent might possibly occasion. But, notwithstanding all the pride and pleasure which the squire took in the prosperity of this successful son, the old man could never be prevailed upon by all Mrs. Josiah's admirable reasonings on the rights of primogeniture to do otherwise than divide his 300 acres of freehold in equal portions between the Reverend Josiah Compton, his son, and Elizabeth Compton, spinster, his daughter. It is highly probable that had this daughter been handsome, or even healthy, the proud old yeoman might have been tempted to reduce her portion to the charge of a couple of £1,000 or so upon the estate; but she was sickly, deformed, and motherless; and the tenderness of the father's heart conquered the desire, which might otherwise have been strong within him, to keep together the fields which for so many generations had given credit and independence to his race. To leave his poor little Betsy in any degree dependent upon her fine sister-in-law was, in short, beyond his strength. So the home croft and the long 14, the 3 Linnycrofts, the 5 Worthies, and the 10-acre clover bit, together with the farmhouse and all its plenishing, and 1/2 of the live and dead farming stock, were bequeathed to Elizabeth Compton and her heirs for ever; not perhaps without some hope, on the part of her good father, that her heirs would be those of her reverend brother also; and so he died with as easy a conscience as ever rocked a father to sleep. But Mrs. Josiah Compton, when she became Mrs. Compton with just 1/2 of the property she anticipated, waxed exceeding wrath; and though her firm persuasion that the hideous little crookback could not live for ever, greatly tended to console and soothe her, it was not without very constant reflections on the necessity of keeping on good terms with her, lest she might make as unnatural a will as her father did before her, that she was enabled to resist the temptation of abusing her openly every time they met; a temptation increased, perhaps, by the consciousness that Miss Betsy held her and all her race in the most sovereign contempt. Betsy Compton was an odd little body, with some vigour of mind and frame too, notwithstanding her deformity; and as the defects in her constitution showed themselves more in her inability to endure fatigue, than in any pain or positive suffering, she was likely to enjoy her comfortable independence considerably longer, and considerably more, than her sister thought it all reasonable in Providence to permit. The little lady arranged her affairs and settled her future manner of life within a very few weeks after her father's death, and that without consulting brother, sister, or any one else. Yet it may be doubted if she could have done it better had she called all the parish to council. She first selected the 2 pleasantest rooms in the house for her bedroom and sitting room, and then skilfully marked out the warmest and prettiest corner of the garden, overlooking some of her own rich pastures, with the fine old grey tower of Silverton in the distance as the place of her bower, her flower garden, and her little apiary. She then let the remainder of her house and the whole of her well-conditioned dairy farm for £300 a year, with as much waiting upon as she might require, as much cream, butter, milk, and eggs as she should use, and as much fruit and vegetables as her tenants could spare, together with half a day's labour every week for her tiny flower garden. She had no difficulty in finding a tenant upon these terms. The son of a wealthy farmer in the neighbourhood had a bride ready as soon as he could find a farmhouse to put her into, and a sufficient dairy upon which to display her well-learned science. Miss Betsy's homestead was the very thing for them. The bride's portion was £500 for the purchase of the late Squire Compton's furniture and the half of his fine stock of cows, etc., etc., the which was paid down in Bank of England notes within 10 minutes after the lease was signed, and being carefully put into the funds by Miss Betsy, became, as she said to herself, but to nobody else, a sort of nest egg, which, as she should only draw out the interest to lay it again in the shape of principal, would go on increasing till she might happen to want it; so that, upon the whole, the style and scale of her expenses being taken into consideration, it would have been difficult to find any lady of any rank more really and truly independent than Miss Betsy. She felt this, and enjoyed it greatly. Now and then, indeed, as she remembered her old father, and his thoughtful care for her, her sharp black eyes would twinkle through a tear; but there was more softness than sorrow in this, and a more contented, or, in truth, a more happy spinster might have been sought in vain, far and near, notwithstanding her humped back. Far different was the case of those who inherited the other moiety of the estate called Compton Basset. The Reverend Josiah, indeed, was himself too gentle and kind-hearted to feel anger against his father, or a single particle of ill will towards his sister. Yet was he as far from sharing her peace and contentment as his disappointed and vituperative wife. How, indeed, can any man hope to find peace and contentment, even though he pass the Rubicon of ordination, and has been happy enough to marry the favourite flirt of 10 successive regiments, if he be never permitted to close his eyes in sleep till he has been scolded for an hour, and never suffered to wake at any signal, save the larum of his lady's tongue? It was in vain that day and night he continued submissively to reiterate the phrases, "To be sure, my dear," "Certainly," "There is no doubt of it," "He ought not to have done so, my love," "You are quite right, my dear," and the like. All this, and a great deal more submission and kindness, was in vain. Mrs. Compton's complainings ceased not, and what was harder still, she always contrived, by some ingenious mode of reasoning, to prove that all the mischief which had happened was wholly and solely her husband's fault. Meanwhile, the 2 little girls sent to bless this union of masculine softness and feminine hardness grew on and prospered, as far as animal health went, just as much as if their father were not taking to smoking, and hot toddy as a consolation for all his sorrows, or their mother to a system of visiting and gossiping which left her no time, had she possessed the talent, to do more for their advantage than take care that they had enough to eat. They were very fine on Sundays, or whenever their ma expected company, and not too dirty at other times to pass muster at the day school at which they were destined to receive all the education which fate intended for them. Miss Betsy, little as she admired her sister-in-law, and dearly as she loved her sunny garden in summer, and her snug chimney corner in winter, now and then left both to pass a few hours in Silverton; for she loved her brother, despite the weakness of character which appeared to her keen faculties to be something very nearly approaching fatuity; and being as well aware as the prettiest young lady in the town could be, that she was herself totally unfit to be married, she looked to his children with the interest with which human beings are apt to consider those who must be the possessors of all they leave behind. For many years Miss Betsy looked forward with hope for one of the 2 greatly desired events. That most coveted was the death of her sister-in-law. The other, and for many years the most probable, was the birth of a male heir to her brother. But time wore away, and both were abandoned. Had it been otherwise, had Miss Betsy seen a male Compton ready to unite in his own person all the acquired and inherited honours of his twaddling father, and all the daily increasing hoard that she was herself accumulating, her temper of mind would probably have been very different. As it was, she looked upon the little girls as much more belonging to their mother than to their father, and the steady thriftiness which, had it been pursued for the sake of a nephew, would have had some mixture of generous devotion in it, now that its result could only benefit nieces, by no means very dearly loved, seemed to threaten the danger of her becoming saving for mere saving's sake. There was, however, in the heart of Miss Betsy much to render such an incrustation of character difficult ; but there was also much to displease her in those who alone could claim her kindness on the plea of kindred ; so that the most acute observer might have been at a loss to say what tone her vexed temper might finally take towards them. Nevertheless, the two young sisters, at the respective ages of 15 and 17, were as forward and handsome girls as ever drew the attention of a country town. They were equally handsome, perhaps, though very unlike. Martha was tall, dark-eyed, fresh-coloured, bold-spirited, and believed in her heart that she was to be called my lady, and to drive in a coach and four. Sophia, the younger girl, was less tall and less bright coloured. Her hair was light, and her eyes, though their lashes were black, were of the softest gray. Her chief beauty, however, consisted in a complexion of great delicacy, and a mouth and teeth that could hardly be looked at without pleasure, even by cross Miss Betsy herself. Miss Martha Compton was a young lady endowed with a vast variety of brilliant talents. She could dance every night, and very nearly all night long, though she had only learned for 6 weeks. She could make pasteboard card boxes and screens, work satin stitch, and, like most other clever young ladies bred in a country town abounding with officers, quote the oft profaned lyrics of Tom Moore. The reputation of her sister for talents rested on a basis much less extended. It would indeed have been a false concord to talk of her talents, for she had but one in the world. Untaught, and unconscious of the power nature had bestowed, she sang with the sweet shrillness of the lark ; and had science been set to work upon her for 6 months, Silverton might have boasted one of the finest native voices in the kingdom. Mrs. Compton was proud of both her daughters ; and however difficult it might be to procure shoes and gloves out of an income of somewhat less than £400 a year, the winter balls of Silverton never opened till the Miss Comptons were ready to stand up. Had she been a little less brutally cross to her poor husband, Mrs. Compton would really at this time have been almost interesting from the persevering industry and ingenuity with which she converted the relics of her own maiden finery into fashionable dancing dresses for her girls. And on the whole, the Miss Comptons were astonishingly well dressed ; for besides the above-mentioned hoards, every article of the family consumption was made to contribute to the elegance of their appearance. Brown sugar was substituted for white at the morning and the evening meal. The butcher's bills were kept down wonderfully by feeding the family upon tripe twice a week. The home brewed was lowered till the saving in malt for 1 year bought 2 glazed calico slips, 4 pair of long white gloves, and a bunch of carnations for Martha and of lilies for Sophia. Nothing, in short, was overlooked or forgotten that could be made to distil 1 drop of its value towards decorating the beauties of Silverton. Few subjects have furnished more various or more beautiful images for the poet's pen than maternal fondness. From the heart-stirring fury of the dauntless lioness when her young ones are threatened, down to the patient hen red breast as she sits a brood, lonely, fasting, and apart from all the joys of birdhood awaiting the coming life of her loved nestlings, in short, from one extremity of animal creation to the other, volumes of tender anecdotes have been collected illustrative of this charming feature of female nature. And yet much still remains to be said of it. Where is the author who has devoted his power of looking into the human heart to the task of describing the restless activity, the fond watchfulness, the unwearied industry of a proud, poor, tender mother, when labouring to dress her daughters for a ball? Who has told of the turnings, the dyeings, the ironings, the darnings, that have gone to make misses of £10 a year pin money look as smart as the squanderer of 500? Yet such things are. The light of morning never steals into the eyes of mortals to spur them on again to the deeds of greatness after nightly rest, without awakening many hundred mothers whose principal business in life is to stitch, flounce, pucker, and embroider for their daughters. All this is very beautiful. I speak not of the stitching, flouncing, puckering, and embroidering, but of the devotion of the maternal hearts dedicated to it. All this is very beautiful. Yet never has gifted hand been found to bring forth in delicate pencilling traits such as these with half the study that has been often bestowed on the painting a cobweb. This is unjust. Great, however, as were Mrs. Compton's exertions for the establishment of her daughters by the ways and means above described, her maternal efforts were not confined to these. For their sakes she on one occasion armed herself for an enterprise which, notwithstanding the resolute tone of her character, cost her some struggles. This desperate undertaking, which was nothing less than the penetrating to the rarely invaded retreat of Miss Betsy, for the purpose of asking her to give the girls a little money, was occasioned by a great event in the annals of Silverton. The officers of the regiment, a detachment of which had been quartered there for a 12-month, gallantly determined to give the neighbouring families a fete before they left the town, in return for the hospitalities they had received. I am writing of the year 1813, a period when the palmy days of country quarters still existed, and many may still remember the tender sensibilities excited by a departing regiment, and the gay hopes generated by an arriving one. Either of these events as well calculated to chase the composure of spirits arising from the unbroken routine of ordinary existence, and it may easily be imagined that, upon an occasion where the effects of both were brought to act upon the hearts and souls of a set of provincial fair ones at the same moment, the emotions produced must have been of no ordinary nature. Such was the case at the fete given by the first battalion of the regiment on their leaving Silverton; for as it chanced that they were to be replaced by the second battalion of the same corps, the compliment intended for the neighbourhood was so arranged as to be shared by the officers who were about to be introduced to it; and thus an immense mass of joys and sorrows, regrets and hopes, tears and smiles, all came into action at once; and volumes might be filled in the most interesting manner solely in describing the states of mind produced in the most charming portion of the inhabitants of 27 of the principal houses of Silverton and its vicinity. "It was so quite unlike any other party that ever was given," as Mrs. Compton well observed in talking over the matter with her daughters, "that it was downright impossible not to make some difference in the way of preparing for it." "Different! I believe it is different," exclaimed Miss Martha. "It is the first ball we ever showed ourselves at by daylight, and I should like to know how we, that always lead everything, are to present ourselves in broad sunshine with dyed pink muslin and tarnished silver." "You can't and you shan't," replied her affectionate mother, "if I sell the silver spoons and buy plated ones instead. I will not have my girls disgraced in the face of 2 regiments at once. But upon my life, girls, money is not to be had for the asking; for truth it is, and no lie, that there is not above £20 in the bank to last till Michaelmas, and the butcher has not been paid these 5 months. But don't look glum, Martha. Shall I tell you what I have made up my mind to do?" "Carry a plate round the mess room, mamma, when they are all assembled, perhaps," replied the lively young lady, "and if you asked for aid for the sake of our bright eyes, it is likely enough you might get something. But if it is not that, what is it, mother?" "Why, I will walk over to Compton Basett, Martha, and ask the Ram's Horn, your aunt, for £5 outright, and tell her into the bargain what it is for, and, stingy and skinflint as she is, I can't say that I shall be much surprised if she gives it, for she is as proud as she's ugly, and it won't be difficult to make her see this time that I am asking more for credit's sake than for pleasure." "Go, mother, by all means," replied the young lady with a sneer that seemed to indicate despair of any aid from Miss Betsy. "All I know is that she never gave me anything since I was born but a Bible and prayer book, and it don't strike me as very likely she'll begin now. Set off, however, by all manner of means, and if you come back empty handed, I'll tell you what my scheme shall be." "Tell me now, Martha," said the mother. "It's no joke, I can tell you striding over the hill this broiling day. I don't want to go for nothing, I promise you. Tell us your scheme, girl, at once." "Why, if I was you, mother, I would go to Smith's shop, and tell him confidentially that I wanted a little more credit, and that everything would be sure to be settled at Christmas." "That won't do, Martha Compton. Your father has given him a bill already for £30, due in November, and it is a chance if it gets honoured, I promise you. Smith knows too much about our money matters to be caught napping." "Well, then, set off, mother. I'd offer to go with you, only I know that Captain Tate will be sure to be walking on the Hatherton Road, and I shouldn't wonder yet if he was to come out with a proposal." "Oh, never mind me, child, I can go alone, and that's what you can't do, my dear. You must take Sophy with you, mind that, and don't get talked of just as the new set are coming in."
Nay, for that matter, Sophy will be as likely to meet Willoughby as I shall be to meet Tate, so there's no fear I should have to go alone." " Well, take care of yourselves, and don't let the sun get to tan your necks, mind that." Having given these parting injunctions, Mrs. Compton set forth upon her expedition, the result of which shall be given in the next chapter. CHAPTER II. A sisterly visit and a cheerful reception. The retreat of a rural heiress. Interesting conversation. An unsatisfactory letter. Mrs. Compton said no more than the truth when she declared that it was no joke to walk from Silverton to Compton Basset in the dog days. A long shadeless hill was to be mounted, several pastures, beautifully open to the sun, with all their various styles, were to be conquered, and finally a rough stony lane that might have crippled the hoof of a jackass was to be painfully threaded before she could find herself at Miss Betsy's door. Yet all this she undertook, and all this she performed, strengthened by the noble energy of maternal love. On reaching at length the comfortable, well-conditioned abode of her husband's rural ancestors, she so far suspended her steadfast purpose as to permit herself to drop into a deliciously cool woodbine-covered seat in the porch, and there indulged the greatly needed luxuries of panting and fanning herself at her ease for a few minutes, before she set to work on the stony heart of the spinster. Just as she was beginning to think that it was time her rest should end, and her important labour begin, a curly-headed little girl of some 8 or 9 years old came from the house, and very civilly asked her, what she pleased to want. " I want to see Miss Betsy. Can't you go to her, my little girl, and tell her that her sister, Mrs. Compton, is come to pay her a visit?" " Yes, ma'am," replied the child. " There she is. You can see her if you please to look this way. There, at the end of the long walk, where you see the bit of grass plat and the 2 elm trees. Miss Betsy always sits in her bower in a sunshiny morning watching the bees." " Well, trot away to tell her Mrs. Compton is coming, and then she won't be surprised, you know." The child did as she was bid, tripping lightly along a well-kept gravel walk, which led to the grass plat, while Mrs. Compton followed with sedater step behind. How the announcement of her arrival was received by the little spinster she could not judge, though she was at no great distance when it was made ; but her messenger having entered beneath the flowery shelter of Miss Betsy's bower, both parties were effectually concealed from her sight, and, despite the profound contempt she constantly expressed for the little fright, she paused at some paces from the entrance to await the child's return. The interval was not long ; but though her little envoy speedily reappeared, she brought no message, and silently pointing to the bower, ran back towards the house. Mrs. Compton looked after her, as if she had rather she would have remained ; but she called her courage, of which she had usually a very sufficient stock, to aid her in meeting the ugly little body's queer ways, and marched forward to the encounter. A few steps brought her to the front of Miss Betsy's bower, and there she saw the still happy heiress seated on a bench, which, though it might upon occasion hold 2 persons, had nevertheless very much the comfortable air of an arm-chair, with a last year's new novel on a little table before her, a subscription to a library at Exeter being one of her very few expensive indulgences. Miss Betsy's dress was always as precisely neat and nice as that of a Quaker ; and on the present occasion no bonnet concealed the regular plaiting of her snow-white muslin cap, which, closely fitting round her pale but intelligent features, was so peculiarly becoming, that her visitor muttered in her heart, " She can dress herself up, nasty crooked little thing, and we shall soon see if she has generosity enough to make her nieces look half as smart." " Good morning to you, sister Betsy." It was thus she began the difficult colloquy that she was come to hold. " You look charming well to day, with your beautiful cap, and your pretty arbour, and your book, and your arm chair, and all so very snug and comfortable. Ah, goodness me ! Nobody knows but those who have tried, what a much finer thing it is to be single than married." " Did you come all the way from Silverton, Mrs. Compton, to tell me that?" said the lady of the bower, pointing to a stool that stood at the entrance. " Why, no, sister Betsy, I can't say I did," replied Mrs. Compton, seating herself. " I am come upon an errand not over agreeable, I assure you ; neither more nor less than to talk of your poor brother's troubles and difficulties ; and what is worst of all, I don't feel over sure that you will care anything about it." " And what makes you think that, Mrs. Compton ?" said Miss Betsy, in a sort of cheerful, clear voice, that certainly did not evince any painful acuteness of sympathy. " How can I think that you care much about him, or any of us, sister Betsy, since 'tis months and months that you have never come near us I am sure we often talk of you, and wish you would be a little more sociable." " That is exceedingly obliging, Mrs. Compton," replied Miss Betsy, in the same cheering, happy tone of voice, " and I should be very wrong not to oblige you, if I could fancy that my doing so could be of any real use or service. But to tell you the truth, I suspect that my poor brother likes to have a better dinner when I am at table than when I am not ; and if all's true that gossips tell about his butcher's bill, that can be neither right nor convenient. And as for you, Mrs. Compton, and the young ladies, I greatly doubt if my frequent appearance among you would contribute much to your intimacy with the officers. You talk very strangely, sister Betsy. I am sure that I was not thinking of the officers at all, but only of how glad we always were to see you." " That is very kind indeed," replied the provoking spinster in the same happy voice ;" and I assure you that I do believe my brother likes to see me very much, and what is more remarkable still, I have more than once fancied that my niece Sophy looked rather pleased when I came in. And so did Martha, I am sure, and so did I, sister Betsy, you can't deny that. Then why don't you come to see us oftener?" " For no reason in the world," replied Miss Betsy gaily, " but because I like to stay at home better." " So much the worse for us ! So much the worse for us, sister Betsy. If you had been to see us, you must have found out what I am now come to tell you, and that is, that poor dear Josiah is in very great difficulty indeed ; and though we generally, I must say, bear all our hardships remarkably well, yet just at this time it comes upon us with unbearable severity." " Does it indeed, Mrs. Compton ? But you have never yet turned your head to look at my bees. For my part, I can sit and watch them by the hour together, if my book is not too interesting. Careful little fellows ! It is but just 3 o'clock," standing up as she spoke to look out upon a sun dial that glittered in the middle of the grass plat, " but just past 3, and they are beginning to come home with their work already." Mrs. Compton felt what the French call deroutee, but she recovered herself, and returned to the charge. " You are a happy woman, sister Betsy," said she, " with nothing to care about but your books and your bees." " I am very happy indeed," replied the maiden, in an accent that well befitted the words, " and so are my bees too, for it is beautiful weather, and one can almost see the flowers grow, they come on so finely. But I want to talk to you, sister Betsy, about our troubles. You don't know how I slave and fag to make our poor girls look like somebody. No Saturday night ever comes that I do not sit up till past midnight striving to make their things decent for Sunday." " Do you indeed, Mrs. Compton ? I was told that they wore pink bows in their bonnets last Sunday, and green the Sunday before ; but I did not know that you sat up to change them. Change them ? God bless you ! I wish that was all I have got to do. Why, I had to wash those pink ribbons, and then dip them in saucer pink, and then rub them very nearly dry, till my poor arms almost came off, and then iron them, and then sew in the wire riband again, and then make them up. I'll leave you to judge how much sleep I was likely to get ; for I could not have the bonnets till after the girls came home from the evening parade, where they had been with Mrs. Colonel Williamson. They never go to parade without one of the regimental ladies as a chaperon." " But why don't the young ladies rub their ribbons a little themselves ?" asked Miss Betsy. " Oh, that would not answer at all, sister Betsy. Why, that very Saturday night they were at a musical party at Colonel Williamson's, and Sophy was the principal lady singer. She and that elegant young Willoughby always sing together, and the best judges in Silverton say it is as fine as anything in London." " Well, that's very nice indeed, Mrs. Compton ; and I don't suppose she could well rub her ribbons while she was singing." As she said this, Miss Betsy's eye returned, as if drawn by some strong attraction, as had been often the case before since the conversation began, to the volume that lay open on the little table before her. Mrs. Compton became desperate, and rising from her stool approached the table, and boldly closed the book. " Upon my word, you must hear what I have got to say, sister Betsy, and leave alone reading for a minute or so, while I talk to you of what concerns the honour of your family." " The honour of the family ?" said the spinster, in an accent of some alarm, employing herself, however, in finding her place again, and then putting a mark in it. " I hope you have got nothing very bad to tell me about the young ladies, Mrs. Compton." " Nothing in the world but good, sister Betsy, if you will but lend us a helping hand once and a way. You seem to know all the news, and therefore I dare say you have heard that the first battalion of the are to go to Plymouth on the 17th, and that the second battalion are to march into Silverton on the same day. So the Colonels have agreed that a fete, a public breakfast and dancing to the band in tents, in a field behind the Spread Eagle, shall be given by the officers of the 1st Battalion on the 16th, and that all, or nearly all the officers of the 2nd Battalion shall have leave to come forward one day's march to join it, and be introduced to all the neighbourhood. Now, just fancy our girls being invited to such a party as this, and not having a dress in the world that they can go in. Just tell me what you think of this, Sister Betsy." " Not having had much experience in such matters, Mrs. Compton, I am really quite at a loss to guess what it is that young ladies are likely to do in such a case. Don't you think it would be very natural, Sister Betsy, to turn towards some kind, generous, rich relation, and ask their help out of such a strait? Don't you think this would be natural and right, Sister Betsy?" " Yes, very natural and right, indeed, Mrs. Compton." " Thank God ! Then all our troubles are at an end. Dear, blessed Sister Betsy I £10 will be quite enough for us all, and buy a pair of new black stockings for Josiah into the bargain, in case he should like to go." Miss Betsy made no reply, but drawing the table a little towards her, opened her book and began to read. " It's a long walk I have to go, sister," resumed Mrs. Compton, " and I shall be particularly glad to get home ; so will you have the kindness to give me the money at once ?"" Ma'am ?" said Miss Betsy, looking up with a most innocent expression of countenance. " Whatever sum you may be pleased to grant us, Sister Betsy, I beg and entreat you to give me directly." " So I would, Mrs. Compton, without a moment's delay," replied Miss Betsy, with the most cheerful good humour, " only I don't intend to give you any money at all." " Oh ! isn't that treachery ? Isn't that cruelty ?" exclaimed the agitated matron, wringing her hands. " Did not you say, Sister Betsy, that it would be the most natural and right thing in the world to ask one's rich relations in such a moment as this ?"" But I never said it would be right to ask me, Mrs. Compton." " But you meant it, if you did not say it, and that I'm sure you can't deny. And isn't it hard hearted to disappoint me now ?"" It is a great deal more hard hearted in you, Mrs. Compton, to take upon you to say that I am rich. I am a poor crooked ram's horn of a body, as you know well enough, and I want the comfort and the consolation of all the little countrified indulgences that my good father provided for me by his will. You were a beauty, Mrs. Compton, and your daughters are beauties, and it must be a great blessing to be a beauty. But when God denied me this, he gave me a kind hearted father who took care that if I could not have lovers, I should have wherewithal to do tolerably well without them. And I am not going to fly in the face of Providence, or of my father either, in order to dress you and your daughters up to please the officers. So now, Mrs. Compton, I think you had better go home again." " And is this the way you treat your poor brother's children, Miss Betsy ? Your own flesh and blood ? And they, poor girls, sitting at home in the midst of their faded, worn out trumpery, and thinking what a disgrace they shall be to the name of Compton in the eyes of all the country, if their aunt Betsy won't come forward to help them. Stop a minute, Mrs. Compton, and I will help them in the best manner I can. But I must go into my own room first, and you may sit here the while." " Will you give me a draught of milk, Sister Betsy ?" said the again sanguine visitor. " My mouth is perfectly parched." The same little girl who had acted as her usher was again within call, and Miss Betsy summoned her by name. " Go to your mother, Sally, and desire her to spare me a pennyworth of fresh milk ; and here, my dear, is the money to pay for it. Don't drop it, Sally." " Dear me, Sister Betsy, I don't want to put you to the expense of a penny for me. I thought that you had milk allowed you in your rent." " And so I have, as much as I can use. But you are not me, Mrs. Compton ; and I make a great point of being just and exact in all ways. And now I will go for what I promised you." In about 10 minutes the little lady returned with something in her hand that looked like a sealed letter. " Please to give this to my nieces, Mrs. Compton, with my good wishes for their well doing and happiness. And now, if you please, I will wish you good morning, for I am rather tired of talking. Don't open that letter, but give it sealed to your daughters. Good morning, Mrs. Compton." Miss Betsy then carefully took up the empty cup which her visitor had drained, and returned to the house, leaving her sister in law to set off upon her homeward walk in a condition painfully balancing between hope and fear. Nevertheless, she obeyed the command she had received, and delivered the letter unopened into the hands of her daughter Martha. That young lady tore it asunder by the vehemence of her haste to obtain information as to what it might contain.
But Miss Sophia, who was of a more gentle nature, quietly took the dissevered parts, and having carefully placed them side by side upon the table, read as follows: Niece Martha and Niece Sophia, your mother tells me that you are greatly troubled in your minds as to what dresses you shall appear in at a fete, or entertainment about to be given by some officers. She tells me that your dresses are all very dirty, wherefore I hereby strongly advise you never on any account to put them on again till such time as they shall be made clean; for it is by no means an idle proverb which says, cleanliness is next to godliness. Your mother spoke also of some articles which, as she said, it would be necessary for you to put on upon this occasion, all of which you possessed, but in a state greatly faded; which means, as I take it, that they have lost their colour by exposure to the sun; observing, what is indeed very obviously true, that as this fete or entertainment is to be given by daylight, the loss of colour in these articles would, if seen at such a time, become particularly conspicuous. It is therefore her opinion, and it is in some sort mine also, that the wearing such faded apparel would be exposing yourselves to the unpleasant observations of your richer, cleaner, and smarter neighbours. For which reason my opinion is, and I shall be very glad if it prove useful to you, that you avoid such a disagreeable adventure by staying at home. I am your aunt, Elizabeth Compton. The effect likely to be produced by such a communication as this upon ladies in the situation of Mrs. Compton and her daughters, must be too easily divined to require any description; but the resolution taken in consequence of it by Miss Martha, being rather more out of the common way, shall be related in a chapter dedicated to the subject. End of chapters 1 and 2. Volume 1, Chapters 3 and 4 of The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Graphic description of the most interesting of the Silverton localities. A rencontre not unexpected. A successful manoeuvre. After uttering a few of those expressions which, by a very remarkable sort of superstition, most nations of the civilized world hold to be a relief under vexation, Miss Martha Compton resumed the bonnet and parasol which she had but recently laid aside, and without consulting either mother or sister, who were occupied in a reperusal of Miss Betsy's epistle, she sallied forth, and deliberately took her way in a direction leading towards the barracks, which were situated close by the turnpike that marked the entrance of the town. Let it not be supposed, however, that the young lady had any intention of entering within the boundary of that region, whose very name is redolent to all provincial female hearts as much of terror as of joy. She had no such desperate measure in her thoughts. Nor was there need she should. For between the curate's dwelling and the barrack yard there was a three-cornered open space planted with lime trees, displaying on one side some of the handsomest shops in the town, among which were the pastry cook's and the circulating library, both loved resorts of idle men, and beneath the trees a very well trodden walk, rarely or never without some lounging redcoat to enliven its shade. When it is added that in this open space the band played morning and evening, all the world will be aware that if not the centre, it was decidedly the heart of Silverton, for to and from it the stream of human life was ever flowing, and all its tenderest affections were nourished there. Being by necessity obliged to pass along this walk, or the pavement which skirted the road beside it, Miss Martha Compton had no occasion whatever to enter the barrack yard, or even to approach its enclosure, in order to ensure meeting, within the space of any given hour before mess time, any officer she might wish to see. There was at this particular epoch much of constancy in the feelings of the fair Martha; for though she had parted from Captain Tate only 3/4 of an hour before, it was Captain Tate, and Captain Tate only, that she now wished to see. Nor did she long wish in vain. When her tall person, straight ankles, and flashing eyes first entered upon the High Street parade, Captain Tate was swallowing the 4th spoonful of a raspberry ice, but ere she had reached the middle of it, he was by her side. " Oh, Captain Tate !" she exclaimed, with heightened colour and brightened eyes, " I did not expect to see you again this morning. I thought for certain you would be riding with the Colonel, or the Major, or some of them." " Ah, Miss Martha! You don't know what it is to be ordered from quarters where — you don't know what it is to be torn heart and soul and body asunder, as I shall be in a few days, or you would not fancy one should be riding out of town, as long as one had the power of staying in it." " Oh, dear ! You won't mind it, I'm sure. You will like Plymouth quite as well — or perhaps better than you do Silverton.
We shall all remember you longer than you will remember us." " Do not say so, do not say so. Beautiful Martha, you cannot think it." " I'm sure I do," responded the young lady with a very distinct sigh. It was exceedingly wrong in Captain Tate, yet all his family and intimate friends declared that he was as worthy a fellow as ever lived, it was exceedingly wrong in him to offer his arm to Miss Martha the moment he heard this sigh ; for, in fact, he was engaged to be married to his cousin, and the marriage ceremony was only deferred till he should be gazetted as a Major, yet he scrupled not, as I have related, to offer his arm, saying in a very soft and even tender accent, " I know it is not the etiquette of dear, quiet little Silverton for the officers to offer their arms to the young ladies, but just at the last, at such a moment as this, not even the Lord Mayor of the town himself could think it wrong." This reasoning seemed quite satisfactory, for Miss Martha's arm was immediately placed within his. " It is very true, as you say, Captain Tate, the last time does make a difference. But it will be very dull work for you going to Smith's shop with me, and I must go there because mamma has sent me." " Dull ! Oh, Miss Martha, do you really think that any place can be dull to me where you are ?"" How do I know, Captain Tate ? How can any girl know how much, or how little ?"" Good heaven ! We are at the shop already," said the Captain, interrupting her. " How such dear moments fly !" Miss Martha answered not with her lips, but had no scruple to let her fine large eyes reply with very intelligible meaning, even though at that very moment she had reached the front of the counter, and that Mr. Smith himself stood before her, begging to know her commands. Her arm, too, still confidingly hung upon that of the stylish looking young officer ; and there certainly was both in her attitude and manner something that spoke of an interest and intimacy between them of no common kind. A few more muttered words were exchanged between them before the draper's necessary question met any attention whatever ; yet in general the Miss Comptons were particularly civil to Mr. Smith, and at length, when she turned to answer him, she stopped short before she had well pronounced the words " muslin," saying with an air of laughing embarrassment, and withdrawing her arm, " Upon my word and honour you must go, Captain Tate. I can no more buy anything while you stand talking to me than I can fly." " Did you not promise me ?" said the Captain reproachfully, and not knowing what in the world to do with himself till it was time to dress. " Yes, I know I did," she replied ;" but the truth is," and she pressed both her hands upon her heart, and shook her head, " the thing is impossible. You must leave me, indeed. We shall meet to night at the Major's, you know. Farewell." And she stretched out her hand to him with a smile full of tender meaning. The Captain looked rather puzzled, but fervently pressed her hand, and saying " Au revoir," then left the shop. The young lady looked after him for a moment, and then, turning to Mr. Smith with a look, a sigh, and a smile not at all likely to be misunderstood, said, " I suppose, Mr. Smith, you have heard the news about me?" There never was such a place for gossip as Silverton. Mr. Smith smilingly protested he had heard nothing whatever about her, but added, with very satisfactory significance, that he rather thought he could guess what the news was, and begged very respectfully to wish her joy of it. " You are very kind, Mr. Smith. I am sure it is the last thing I expected — so much above me in every way. And now, Mr. Smith, I want to speak to you about the things that must be bought. I am sure you are too neighbourly and too kind to put difficulties in my way. It is a very different thing now, you know, as to what I buy, and I am sure you will let me have quite on my own account, and nothing at all to do with papa, a few things that I want very much at the present moment." Miss Martha looked so handsome, and the whole affair seemed so clear and satisfactory, that Mr. Smith, careful tradesman as he was, could not resist her appeal, and declared he should be happy to serve her with whatever articles she might choose to purchase. Her dark eyes sparkled with the triumph of success. She had often felt her own powers of management swelling within her bosom when she witnessed the helpless despondency of her father, or listened to the profitless grumbling of her mother, upon every new pecuniary pressure that beset them ; and it is not wonderful if she now believed, more firmly than ever, that much suffering and embarrassment might very often be spared, or greatly alleviated, by the judicious exercise of such powers as she felt conscious of possessing. As a proof that her judgment was in some measure commensurate with her skill, she determined not to abuse the present opportunity by contracting a debt which it would be quite impossible for her father to pay.
So, notwithstanding all the tempting finery with which the confiding Mr. Smith spread the counter, she restrained her purchases to such articles as it might really have endangered all their schemes of future conquest to have been without, and then took her leave, amidst blushes and smiles, and with many assurances to the gently facetious shopkeeper, that let her be where she would, she should never forget his obliging civility. It was a moment of great triumph for Martha when Mr. Smith's man arrived, and the huge and carefully packed parcel was brought up to the chamber where Mrs. Compton and her daughter sat at work. " What in the world is this? " exclaimed the mother, seizing upon it. " Is it possible that her letter was only a joke, and that the little fright has actually sent you some dresses at last? "" It is much more likely, I fancy, that I have coaxed Mr. Smith into giving us a little more credit. It can all be paid off by a little and a little at a time, you know ; and at any rate, here are some very pretty dresses for the fete, besides about £3 worth of things that we really could not do without any longer." " And do you really mean, Martha, that you have got Smith to send in all these beautiful things on credit? "" I do indeed, mamma." " Was there ever such a girl? Only look, Sophy, at this lovely muslin. Why, it will wash and make up again with different trimmings as good as new for a dozen regiments to come. Oh, you dear clever creature, what a treasure you are! I wish to God I had trusted all to you from the first, and not tired myself to death by walking over to that stingy little monster ; but, tired or not, we must cut these dear sweet dresses out at once. Nancy Baker must come in and make the bodies, and we must set to, girls, and run the seams ; and a pleasure it will be too, God knows. I have worked at turning and twisting old gowns into new ones till I have hated the sight of an ironing box and a needle. But this is another guess sort of a business, and I shall set about it with a right good will, I promise you." And so she did, and the dresses went on prosperously as well as everything else connected with the officers' fete ; and when the wished for but dreaded day arrived, in which so many farewell sighs were to be sighed, and so many last looks looked, and so many scrutinizing glances given as to what might be hoped for from the flirtations of the ensuing year, the sun shone so brightly as evidently to take part with the new comers, permitting not one single cloud to sympathize with those who were about to depart. Of all the beauties assembled at this hybrid festival, none appeared to greater advantage than the Misses Compton. Their dresses were neither dirty nor faded, but exceedingly well calculated to set off their charms as favourably as their mother herself could have desired. Captain Tate, after dancing his last dance with Martha, pointed her out, with some feeling of triumph, to one of the new arrivals as the girl upon whom he had bestowed the largest share of his regimental gallantries ; but he was far from imagining as he did so, how very much better she had contrived to manage the flirtation than himself. She had made it the means of clothing herself and sister from top to toe, while to him it had been very costly in gloves, ices, eau de cologne, and dancing pumps. CHAPTER IV. A WEDDING AND ITS CONSEQUENCES. A TRANSFER OF PROPERTY. MISS MARTHA RECEIVES A PROPOSAL OF MARRIAGE. ANOTHER EXPEDITION to Compton Basett. The regimental gala, which had been looked forward to with so much interest, though very gay and very agreeable, did not perhaps produce all the results expected by the soft hearts and bright eyes of Silverton, for only one wedding was achieved in consequence of it. This one made a very hasty and imprudent bride of Sophia Compton. Her charming voice, joined to her pretty person, was too enchanting for the enthusiastic Lieutenant Willoughby to leave behind him ; and just as the full moon rose upon the tents of the revellers, he drew her gently into the deep shadow of that appropriated to the sutlers, and there swore a very solemn oath that it was quite impossible he should continue to exist if she refused to elope with him that evening. Upon the whole, Miss Sophia was by no means sorry to hear this, but could not help expressing a modest wish that he would be so obliging as to change the plan of operations, and instead of eloping with her, would just speak to papa, and so be married in a proper way. For a considerable time, longer indeed than it was possible to remain in the shadow of the sutler's tent, the young gentleman declared this to be impossible ; because in that case his own relations must be informed of the affair, and he knew perfectly well that if this happened, effectual measures would be taken to prevent his ever possessing his adorable Sophia at all. These arguments were repeated and dwelt upon with very convincing energy, for the space of one whole quadrille, during which the tender pair sat ensconced behind a fanciful erection, on the front of which was traced, in letters formed of laurel leaves, the words,
to the ladies." Nor was his pretty listener insensible to their force, or the probable truth of the misery they predicted. It was, therefore, all things considered, much to the credit of Miss Sophy that she persevered in her refusal of accepting him on the terms he offered. Lieutenant Willoughby was by no means a wicked young man, but it was his nature to covet particularly whatever it was least convenient to obtain; and it was, I believe, of him that a youthful anecdote has been recorded which sets this disposition in a striking point of view. Upon occasion of some dainty but pernicious delicacy being forbidden, or some frolic tending too strongly to mischief being stopped, he is said to have exclaimed, "It is a very, very shocking thing, mamma, that everything that is nice is called wrong, and everything that is nasty is called right." This was said when he was 7 years old, but at 22 he was very nearly of the same unfortunate opinion, and invariably valued everything in proportion to the conviction he felt that he should be opposed in his pursuit of it. When, therefore, Miss Sophia persisted in her declaration that she would not run away with him, Lieutenant Willoughby became perfectly desperate in his determination to obtain her; and having a sort of natural instinct which convinced him that no proposal of marriage would be ill received by Mrs. Compton, he wrung the hand of his Sophy, implored her not to dance with anybody else, and then having sought and found her mother amidst the group of matrons who sat apart admiring their respective daughters, he drew her aside, and told his tale of love. This, as he expected, was by no means unkindly received; and when Mrs. Compton, having recovered from her first ecstasy, began to hint at income and settlement, the impassioned young gentleman contrived to puzzle her so completely, by stating the certainty of his being disinherited if his marriage were immediately known, and the handsome fortune it was possible he might have if it were kept profoundly secret, that he sent her home as vehemently determined to let him marry her daughter, without saying a word to his family about the matter as he could possibly have desired. The result of this may be easily divined. Nothing approved by Mrs. Compton was ever effectually opposed by Mr. Compton. So Miss Sophia was married to Lieutenant Willoughby within 10 days of the regimental ball, and within 1 year afterwards a female infant, called Agnes Willoughby, was placed in the care of the curate of Silverton and his wife; her young mother being dead, and her broken-spirited father about to set off for the West Indies, having found his father implacable, his well-married sisters indignant, and nothing left him whereon to found a hope of escape from his difficulties except thus giving up his little girl to her grandfather, and exchanging his commission in the gay regiment for one in a corps about to embark for a service very likely to settle all his embarrassments by consigning him to an early tomb. Meanwhile, the curate of Silverton was becoming every day more involved in debt; and his dashing eldest daughter, though handsomer than ever, painfully conscious that among all the successive legions of lovers whose conspicuous adorations had made her the most envied of her sex, there was not one who had offered any rational probability of becoming her husband. The first of these misfortunes was the most embarrassing, and so imperiously demanded a remedy, that the poor curate at length consented to find it in the sale of his moiety of his paternal acres. It is certain that his nightly potations of hot toddy had very considerably impaired his powers of caring for anything. Nevertheless, it was not without a pang that he permitted his wife to insert an advertisement in the county paper, proclaiming the sale by auction of certain crofts and meadows, barns and byres, making part and parcel of a capital dairy farm, known by the name of Compton Basset. When the day of sale arrived, several competitors appeared, who bid pretty briskly for the lot; for the land, particularly 30 acres of it, known by the name of the Butcher's Close, was some of the best in the county; but the successful candidate, who, it was pretty evident from the first, was determined that it should be knocked down to no one else, was Farmer Wright, Miss Betsy's prosperous and well-deserving tenant. This, though the purchase was a large one for a mere farmer, amounting to £6,525, did not greatly surprise the neighbourhood, for the Wrights were known to be a prudent, thrifty, and industrious race. It is possible they might have been more surprised had they known that it was Miss Betsy herself, and not her tenant, who was the purchaser. But so it was. The 25 years which had elapsed since the death of her father had enabled this careful little lady to accumulate, by means of her rent, her £500 and its compound interest, and the profits of her well-managed apiary, a much larger sum than it required to become the possessor of her brother's share of Compton Basset; and when she had finished the affair, and leased out the whole property, the Butcher's Close included, to her friend and tenant Farmer Wright, for the annual rent of £600, now including 2 chickens per week for her own use, she still remained possessed of £4,000 sterling safely lodged in the funds; a property which went on very rapidly increasing, as her scale of expense never varied, and rarely exceeded £10 per annum beyond the profits of her bees and her stipulated accommodation from the farm. But, in spite of this strict economy, Miss Betsy was no bad neighbour to the poor, and in a small and very quiet way did more towards keeping dirt and cold out of their dwellings than many who spent 3 times as much upon them, and made 10 times as much fuss about it. It was not, however, till many years later that the fact of her being the possessor of the whole of the Compton Basett estate became known to any one but Farmer Wright; and as to the amount of her half-yearly increasing property in the funds, she had no confidant but her broker. This mystery, this profound secrecy, in the silent rolling up of her wealth, was perhaps the principal source of her enjoyment from it. It amused her infinitely to observe, that while the bad management and improvidence of her brother and his wife were the theme of eternal gossipings, her own thrift seemed permitted to go quietly on without eliciting any observation at all. Her judicious and regularly administered little charities assisted in producing this desired effect, much more than she had the least idea of; for the praises of Miss Betsy's goodness and kindness proceeded from many who had profited more from her judgment and her well-timed friendly loans than from her donations; and the gratitude for such services was much more freely and generally expressed than if the favours conferred had been merely those of ordinary almsgiving. It was therefore very generally reported in Silverton that Miss Betsy Compton gave away all her income to charity, which was the reason why she never did anything to help her embarrassed relations. These erroneous reports were productive of at least one advantage to the family of the curate of Silverton, for it effectually prevented their having any expectations from her beyond a vague and uncertain hope, that if she did not bequeath her farmhouse and acres to an hospital, the property might be left to them. But not even the croaking ill will of Mrs. Compton could now anticipate a very early date for this possible bequest; for pale and delicate looking as she ever continued, nobody had ever heard of Miss Betsy's having a doctor's bill to pay; and as she was just 7 years younger than her brother the curate, who moreover was thought to be dropsical, there appeared woefully little chance that her death would ever benefit her disappointed sister-in-law at all. A very considerable portion of the purchase money of the estate had dwindled away; the little Agnes Willoughby had attained the age of 11 years, and Mr. Compton had become so ill as to have been forced to resign his curacy, when Mr. Barnaby, the celebrated surgeon and apothecary of Silverton, who for the last 10 years had admired Miss Martha Compton more than any lady he had ever looked upon, suddenly took courage, and asked her point blank to become his wife. Had he done this some few years before, his fate would have been told in the brief monosyllable No, uttered probably with as much indignation as any sound compounded of 2 letters could express; but since that time the fair Martha had seen so many colonels, majors, captains, ay, and lieutenants too, march into the town, and then march out again, without whispering anything more profitable in her ear than an assurance of her being an angel, that the case was greatly altered, and after the meditation of a moment, she answered very modestly, "You must speak to my mother, Mr. Barnaby." Perfectly satisfied by the reply, Mr. Barnaby did speak to her mother; but the young lady took care to speak to her first, and after a long and very confidential conversation, it was determined between them that the offer of the gentleman should be accepted, that £50 out of the few remaining hundreds should be spent upon her wedding garments, and that whenever it pleased God to take poor Mr. Compton, his widow and little granddaughter should be received into Mr. Barnaby's family. It has not been recorded with any degree of certainty whether these last arrangements were mentioned to the enamoured Galen, when the important interview which decided the fate of Miss Martha took place; but whether they were or not, the marriage ceremony followed with as little delay as possible. 2 circumstances occurred previous to the ceremony which must be mentioned, as being calculated to open the character of my heroine to the reader. No sooner was this important affair decided upon, than Miss Martha told her mamma that it was her intention to walk over to Compton Basett, and inform Miss Betsy of the news herself. " And what do you expect to get by that, Martha? " said the old lady. " I have not forgot yet my walk to Compton Basett just before poor dear Sophy's marriage, nor the trick the little monster played me, making me bring home her vile hypocritical letter as carefully as if it had been a bank note for £100. You must go without me, if you go will, for I have taken my last walk to Compton Basset, I promise you." " I don't want you to trouble yourself about it in any way, mother," replied Miss Martha. " I'll make Agnes walk with me, and whether I get anything out of that little porcupine or not, the walk can do us no great harm." " 'Tis not so hot as when I went, that's certain," said Mrs. Compton, becoming better reconciled to the expedition. " She has never seen Agnes since the poor little thing was thought to be dying in the measles just 5 years ago ; and then, you know, she did hire a nurse, and send in oranges and jellies, and all that sort of trumpery. And who can say but her heart may soften towards her again, when she sees what a sweet pretty creature she is grown? I can't say I have much faith in good looks doing much towards drawing her purse strings. She has seen poor Sophy and me often enough, and I can't say that we ever found our beauty did us any good with her, neither is it that upon which I reckon now. But telling her of a wedding is not begging, you know ; and I don't think it possible but what such a prudent business like wedding as mine may be more to her taste than poor Sophy's, where there was nothing but a few fine sounding names to look to ; and much good they did her, poor thing. Well, set off, Martha, whenever you like. There is no need to make little Agnes look smart, even if I had the means to do it, for it's quite as well that she should be reminded of the wants of the poor child by the desolate condition of her old straw bonnet. When do you think you shall go?" " This afternoon. I'm sure of not seeing Barnaby again till tea time, for he has got to go as far as Pemberton, so we may start as soon as dinner is over." Miss Martha Compton and her young companion set off accordingly about 3 o'clock, and pursued their way, chiefly in silence, to Miss Betsy's abode ; for Agnes rarely spoke to her aunt, except when she was spoken to, and Miss Martha was meditating profoundly the whole way upon the probability of obtaining Mr. Barnaby's consent to the refurnishing his drawing room. It was the month of April, the air deliciously sweet and mild, and birds singing on every tree ; so that, although the leaves were not yet fully out, they found Miss Betsy sitting as usual in her bower, and enjoying as keenly the busy hum about her beehives as ever Miss Martha did the bustling animation produced by the murmuring of a dozen redcoats. Miss Betsy was at this time about 50 years of age, and though the defect in her shape was certainly not lessened by age, she was altogether an exceedingly nice looking little old lady, and her cap was as neat and becoming, and her complexion very nearly as delicate, as at the time of Mrs. Compton's visit, just 12 years before. She fixed her eyes for a moment upon Martha as she approached the bower, but appeared not to know her. The little girl following close behind was for a minute or two invisible, but the instant she caught sight of her, she rose from her seat, and stepping quickly forward, took the child by her hand, drew her in, and placed her on the bench by her side. Little Agnes, who knew she was come to see her aunt, felt assured by this notice that she was in her presence, and, moreover, that she was a very kind person. So, when the old lady, after examining her features very attentively, said, " You are little Agnes, are you not?" she replied, without hesitation or timidity, " Yes, I am. And you are good aunt Betsy, that used to give me the oranges." " Do you remember that, my child? 'Tis a long while, almost half your little life. Take off your bonnet, Agnes, and let me see your face." Agnes obeyed, the desolate straw bonnet was laid aside, and Miss Betsy gazed upon one of the fairest and most delicate little faces that the soft beams of an April sun ever fell upon. The pale recluse kept her keen eyes fixed upon the little girl for many minutes without pronouncing a word. At length she said, but apparently speaking only to herself, " It is just such a face as I wanted her to have. Her father was a gentleman. She will never have red cheeks, that is quite certain." "How do you do, aunt Betsy?" said Miss Martha, in a very clear and distinct voice, probably thinking that she had remained long enough in the background. " Very well, I thank you," was the reply. " And who are you? "" Dear me, aunt, you must say that for fun ; for it is hardly likely you should know Agnes, that was almost a baby the last time you ever saw her, and forget me, that was quite grown up at the same time." " Oh ! then you are Miss Martha, the great beauty, are you? You look very old indeed, Miss Martha, considering that you can't be very much past 30, and that I suppose is the reason I did not know you. How is your poor father, Miss Martha? "" He's very bad, aunt Betsy ; but I hope the news I am come to tell you will be a comfort to him, and please you too." " And what news can that be, Miss Martha? "" I am going to be married, aunt Betsy, to a person that is extremely well off, and able to set me above all poverty and difficulties for ever. and the only thing against it is, that papa cannot afford to give me any money at all for my wedding clothes, which is a dreadful disgrace to the name of Compton. And to tell you the truth at once, for I am a frank, honest-hearted girl, that never hides anything, I am come over here on purpose to ask you to give me a few pounds, just to prevent my having to ask my husband for a shift." "If you have no shift, Miss Martha, while you are wearing such a gay bonnet as that, I think any man must be a great fool for taking you. However, that is his affair, and not mine. I cannot afford to buy your wedding clothes, Miss Martha, nor do I intend ever to give you any money at all for any purpose whatever, either now or at any future period. So, if you are wise, as well as frank, you will never ask me again. If you marry a gentleman, and have children who shall behave according to my notions of honour, honesty, and propriety, it is possible that the little I may leave will be divided among them, and any others whom I may think have an equal claim upon me. But I heartily hope you will have none, for I feel certain I should not like them. And I would rather that the poor little trifle I may have left when I die should go to some one I did like." Miss Martha's heart swelled with rage, yet, remote as Miss Betsy's contingent benefits were likely to be, they had still influence sufficient to prevent her breaking out into open violence, and she sat silent, though with burning cheeks and a beating heart. The address she had just listened to was certainly not of the most agreeable style and tone, but it may be some apology for Miss Betsy's severity to state, that the scene which had taken place in Mr. Smith's shop, rather more than 12 years before, in which a certain Captain Tate took an important though unconscious part, was accurately well known to the little spinster, Mrs. Wright, the wife of her tenant, having witnessed the whole of it. When she had finished her speech to Miss Martha, which was spoken in her usual gay tone of voice, Miss Betsy turned again towards Agnes, who was then standing at the entrance of the bower, earnestly watching the bees. " They are pretty curious creatures, are they not, Agnes? " said she. " I hope some day or other you will be as active and industrious. Do you love to work, my little girl? "" I love to play better," replied Agnes. " Ay, that's because you are such a young thing. And who are your playfellows, Agnes? "" I have not got any playfellows but myself," was the reply. " And where do you play? "" In grandpapa's garden behind the house." " And what do you play at? "" Oh, so many things. I play at making flower beds in the summer, and at snowballs in the winter. And I know a blackbird, and ever so many robin redbreasts, and they know me, and I "" Do you know how to read, Agnes? "" A little," replied the child, blushing deeply. " Come here, then, and read a page of my book to me." Poor Agnes obeyed the summons, and submissively placing herself by the side of her aunt, took the book in her hands and began to read. But it was so very lame and imperfect a performance that Miss Betsy wanted either the cruelty or the patience to let it proceed. And taking the volume away, she said in a graver tone than was usual with her, " Nobody seems to have given themselves much trouble about teaching you, my little girl. But I dare say you will read better by and by. Are you hungry, Agnes? Do you wish for something to eat after your walk? " Delighted at being thus relieved from exposing her ignorance, the little girl replied gaily, " I am very hungry indeed, ma'am." " Then sit here to rest for a few minutes, and I will see what I can get for you." And so saying, Miss Betsy rose, and walked briskly away towards the house. " Old brute !" exclaimed Martha, as soon as she was quite beyond hearing. " There's a hump for you ! Isn't she a beauty, Agnes? "" A beauty, aunt Martha? No, I don't think she is a beauty, though I like the look of her face too. But she certainly is not a beauty, for she is not the least bit like you, and you are a beauty, you know." " And who told you that, child? "" Oh, I have heard grandmamma and you talk about it often. And I heard Mr. Barnaby say when he came in yesterday, ' How are you, my beauty ?' And besides, I see you are a beauty myself." " And pray, Agnes," replied her aunt, laughing with great good humour, " how do you know a beauty when you see one? "" Why, don't I see every time I walk by Mr. Gibbs's shop, his beauties in the window with their rosy cheeks, and their black eyes, and their quantity of fine ringlets? And you are exactly the very image of one of Mr. Gibbs's beauties, aunt Martha." Miss Martha remembered that there was one very pretty face in the window of the village perruquier, and doubted not that the little Agnes's observation had reference to that one. It was therefore with one of her most amiable smiles that she replied, " You little goose, how can I be like a painted wax image
But the protestations and exclamations by which the simile might have been proved good, were broken off by the approach of a maidservant from the house, who said that Miss Betsy was waiting for them. They found the neat little lady in her pretty sitting room, with a lily white cloth spread on a table near the open window, and a home made loaf, a little bowl of native cream, and a decanter of bright spring water, with a couple of tumblers near it. Simple as this repast was, it was well relished by both the nieces, though decidedly served in honour of only one. However, no positive objection being made to Miss Martha's taking her share of it, she spared neither the loaf nor the cream, and, remembering her mother's account of her penny repast, felt something like triumph as she ate, to think how much more she had contrived to get out of her churlish relative. But this was all she got, excepting, indeed, that she felt some consolation for her disappointment in having to tell her mother, on her return, that if she had children, and of course she should as everybody else had, they were to have their share of all the old maid might leave. " Ugly old hypocrite ! It won't be much, take my word for it," replied Mrs. Compton. " She likes all the beggars in the parish a vast deal better than she does her own flesh and blood. Don't talk any more of her, Martha. I should be glad if I was never to hear her name mentioned again." End of chapters 3 and 4. Volume 1, Chapters 5 and 6 of The Widow Barnaby, by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. A visit from the heiress. Miss Agnes Willoughby is sent to school. In about a month after this visit, and less than a week before the day fixed upon for the happiness of Mr. Barnaby, Miss Betsy Compton very unexpectedly made a visit to her brother. She found him a good deal altered, but she found him also with his toddy and pipe, both objects of such hatred and disgust to her anchoritish spirit, that all the kind feelings which might have been awakened by his failing health were chased by looking upon what caused it. To see her feeble-minded brother was not, however, the only or the principal object of her visit to Silverton, and she permitted not many minutes to be wasted in mutual questionings that meant very little, before she let him understand what was. " I am come to speak to you, brother," she said, " about little Agnes. I should like to know in what manner you intend to educate her." " Mrs. Compton manages all that, sister Betsy," replied the invalid, " and at any rate I am sure I have no money to teach her anything." " But it is a sin, brother, to let the child run wild about the garden as you would a magpie. Do you know that she can't read?" " No, sister Betsy, I know nothing at all about it, I tell you. How can I help it? Am I in a condition to teach anybody to read?" " There are others more to blame than you are, brother, no doubt ; but let it be whose fault it will, it must not go on. I suppose you will make no objection to my sending her to school?" " Oh dear no, not I. But you had better ask Mrs. Compton about it." " Very well. But I have your consent, have I not?" " Dear me, yes, sister Betsy. Why do you tease me so, making me take the pipe out of my mouth every minute?" Miss Betsy left the little smoke dried back parlour appropriated to the master of the house, and made her way to the front room up stairs called the drawing room, which had been reserved since time out of mind for the use of the ladies of the family and their visitors. There she found, as she expected, Mrs. Compton and her daughter amidst an ocean of needlework, all having reference, more or less, to the ceremony which was to be performed on the following Thursday. " So, Mrs. Compton," was her salutation to the old lady, and a nod of the head to the young one. " I have been speaking to my brother," continued Miss Betsy, " concerning the education of little Agnes, and he has given his consent to my putting her to school." " His consent !" exclaimed Mrs. Compton. " And pray is she not my grandchild too ? I think I have as good a right to take care of the child as he has." " She has a right," replied the spinster, " to expect from both of you a great deal more care than she has found ; and were I you, Mrs. Compton, I would take some trouble to conceal from all my friends and acquaintance the fact that, at 11 years of age, my grandchild was unable to read. And that's a fact that I can have no need to hide, Miss Betsy, for it's no fact at all. I've seen Martha teaching her scores of times." " Then have her in, Mrs. Compton, and let us make the trial. If I have said what is not true, I will beg your pardon." " Lor, mamma," said Miss Martha, colouring a little, " what good is there in contradicting aunt Betsy if she wants to send Agnes to school? I am sure it is the best thing that can be done for her, now I'm going to be married.
And Mr. Barnaby asked me the other day if you did not mean to send her to school." " I don't want to keep her from school, God knows, poor little thing, or from anything else that could do her good. Only Miss Betsy speaks so sharp. But I can assure you, sister, we should have put her to the best of schools long and long ago, only that, Heaven knows, we had not the means to do it. And thankful shall I be if you are come at last to think that there may be as much charity in helping your own blood relations as in giving away your substance to strangers and beggars. You are right, Mrs. Compton, as far as relates to sending Agnes to school. That will certainly be a charity. When can the child be got ready? As soon as ever you shall be pleased to give us the means, sister Betsy." " Do you mean, Mrs. Compton, that she has not got clothes to go in?" " I do indeed, sister Betsy." " Let me see what she has got, and then I shall know what she wants." " That is easily told, aunt, without your troubling yourself to look over a few ragged frocks and the like. She wants just everything, aunt Betsy," said the bride expectant, brave in anticipated independence, and rather inclined to plague the old lady by drawing as largely as might be on her reluctant funds, now they were opened, even though the profit would not be her own. " If she really does want everything, Martha Compton, while you are dressed as you now are, very cruel injustice has been done," replied the aunt. " Your sister had no portion given her either of the patrimony of her father, or the £1000 brought by her mother ; and as her marriage with a man who had not a sixpence was permitted, this child of hers had an equal right with yourself to share in the property of your parents." " The property of their parents ! Why, bless me, Betsy Compton, how you do talk ! As if you did not know that all the property they ever had is as good as gone. Has not farmer Wright got the estate? And has not the butcher, and the baker, and the shoemaker, and all the rest of them got what it sold for, as well as my £1000 among them, long ago?" " Then you are now on the very verge of ruin, Mrs. Compton," said the spinster gravely. " Yes, sister Betsy, we are," replied the matron reproachfully. " And I can't but say," she continued, " that a lone woman like you, without any expenses whatever but your own meat and drink, which everybody says is next to nothing, I can't but say that you might have helped us a little before now, and no harm done. That is your opinion of the case, Mrs. Compton. Mine is wholly different. I think harm is done whenever power of any kind is exerted in vain. I have no power to help you. Were all I have poured out upon you while I lodged myself in the parish workhouse, my conviction is, that I should only be enabling you to commit more follies, and, in my judgment, more sins. Well, well, Miss Betsy, it is of no use talking to you, I know that of old ; and to tell you the truth, when I do come to beggary, I had rather beg of anybody else than of you. I hear far and near of your charity to others, but I can't say that I ever saw any great symptom of it myself. Let me see what clothes little Agnes has got, Mrs. Compton, if you please. Our time will be more profitably employed in seeing what I may be able to do for her, than in discoursing of what I am not able to do for you. Miss Martha, then, I suppose, may be able to bring her things in." " Why, as far as the quantity goes, they won't be very difficult to carry. But I don't see much use in overhauling all the poor child's trumpery, unless it is just to make you laugh at our poverty, ma'am." The spinster answered this with a look which showed plainly enough that, however little beauty her pale face could boast, it was by no means deficient in expression. Miss Martha hastened out of the room to do her errand without saying another word. I will not give the catalogue of poor Agnes's wardrobe, but only observe that it was considerably worse than Miss Betsy expected. She made, however, no observation upon it ; but having examined it apparently with very little attention, she took leave of the mother and daughter, saying she would call again in a day or two, and took with her, no permission asked, a greatly faded but recently fitted frock, which abduction mother and daughter remonstrated against, loudly declaring it was her best dress, except the old white muslin worked with coloured worsteds, and that she would have nothing upon earth to wear. " It shall not be kept long," was the reply ; and the little lady departed, enduring for a moment the atmosphere of her brother's parlour as she passed, in order to tell him, as she thought herself in duty bound to do, that she should get some decent clothes made for the child, and call again as soon as they were ready to take her to school. The poor gentleman seemed greatly pleased at this, and said, " Thank you, Betsy," with more animation than he had been heard to impart to any words for many years.
It was just 3 days after Miss Martha Compton had become Mrs. Barnaby that the same post chaise drove up to the door that had carried her away from it on an excursion of 8 hours to Exeter, which the gallant bridegroom had stolen a holiday to give her; but on this occasion it was hired neither by bride nor bridegroom, but by the little crooked spinster who was come, according to her promise, to take Agnes to school. Mrs. Compton was just setting out to pay her first morning visit to the bride, and therefore submitted to the hasty departure of the little girl with less grumbling than she might have done, if less agreeably engaged. " You must bid your grandpapa good bye, Agnes," said Miss Betsy, as they passed the door of his parlour, and accordingly they all entered together. " God bless you, my poor little girl," said the old man, after kissing her forehead, " and keep your aunt Betsy's favour if you can, for I don't think I can do much more to help anybody. God bless you, Agnes." " Dear me, Mr. Compton, you need not bring tears in the child's eyes by speaking that way. I am sure she has never wanted friends since her poor dear mother died ; and there's no like she should either, with such an aunt as Martha, married to such a man as Mr. Barnaby. I suppose she is not to be kept from her family, sister Betsy, but that we shall see her in the holidays. I am sure I don't know where she is likely to see things so elegant as at her aunt Barnaby's. Such a drawing room, and a man in livery, at least a boy, and everything else comfortable. I suppose this is to be her home, Miss Betsy, still?" " I am glad you have mentioned this, Mrs. Compton," replied her sister in law, " because now, in the presence of my brother, I may explain my intentions at once. Whatever you may think of my little means, either you or your wife, or your daughter, brother Josiah, I am not rich enough, in my own opinion, to make it prudent for me to saddle myself with the permanent charge of this poor child. Moreover, to do so, I must altogether change the quiet manner of life that I have so long enjoyed, and I am not conscious of being bound by any tie sufficiently strong to make this painful sacrifice a duty. Something I think I ought to do for this child, and I am willing to do it. I conceive that it will be more easily in my power to spare something from my little property to obtain a respectable education for her, than either in yours, brother, or even in that of her newly married aunt Barnaby, for doubtless it would not be agreeable for her to begin her wedded life by throwing a burden upon her husband. But on the other hand, it will certainly be much more within the power of her aunt Barnaby to give her a comfortable and advantageous home afterwards than in mine. I will therefore now take charge of her for 5 years, during which time she shall be supplied with board, lodging, clothes, and instruction at my expense, or, in case I should die, at that of my executors. After this period I shall restore her to you, brother, or to her grandmother, if both or either of you shall be alive, or if not, to her aunt Barnaby. And when I die she shall have a share, with such others as I may think have a claim upon me, of the small matter I may leave behind. But this, of course, must be lessened by the expenses I am now contracting for her." " And are we never to see her for 5 years, sister Betsy? " said Mrs. Compton, very dolorously. " To tell you the truth, Mrs. Compton, I think the coming home to you twice a year for the holidays could be no advantage to her education, and the expense of such repeated journeyings would be very inconvenient to me. I have therefore arranged with the persons who are to take charge of her, that she is to pass the vacations with them. I shall, however, make a point of seeing her myself more than once in the course of the time, and will undertake that she shall come to Silverton twice during these 5 years, for a few days each time. And now, I think there is no more to say. So come, my little girl, for it is not right to keep the driver and the horses any longer waiting." The adieus between the parties were now hastily exchanged, little Agnes mounted the post chaise, aunt Betsy followed, and they drove off, though in what direction they were to go, after leaving the Silverton turnpike, no one had ever thought of inquiring. Poor Mrs. Compton stood for some moments silently gazing after the post chaise, and on re-entering her drawing room, felt a sensation that greatly resembled desolation from the unwonted stillness that reigned there. She was instantly cheered, however, by recollecting the very agreeable visit she was going to pay ; and only pausing to put on her new wedding bonnet and shawl, set off for Mr. Barnaby's, saying to the maid, whom she passed as she descended, " I should like, Sally, to have seen what sort of things she has got for the poor child." "If they was as neat and as nice as the little trunk as was strapped on in the front, and that's where they was packed, no doubt, there wouldn't be no need to complain of them was the reply. And now, leaving Agnes to Aunt Betsy and her fate, I must return to the duty I have assigned myself, and follow the fortunes of Mrs. Barnaby. CHAPTER VI. Wedded happiness. Death of Mrs. Compton. The ex-curate brought into a peaceful harbour. He falls sick, and his sister and grandchild are summoned. The first 5 or 6 months of Mrs. Barnaby's married life were so happy as not only to make her forget all her former disappointments, but almost to persuade her that it was very nearly as good a thing to marry a middle-aged country apothecary, with a good house and a good income, as a beautiful young officer with neither. Since her adventure with Mr. Smith, the draper, milliner, mercer, and haberdasher of Silverton par excellence, Mrs. Barnaby's genius for making bargains had been sadly damped. Not but that she had in some degree saved her credit with that important and much provoked personage by condescending to wear the willow before his eyes. She even went so far as to say to him, with a twinkling of lids that passed for having tears in her own, "No young lady was ever so used before, I believe, I am sure, Mr. Smith. You saw enough yourself to be certain that I was engaged to Captain Tate, yet the moment he found a girl with a little money he sent back all my letters." Perhaps Mr. Smith believed the lady, perhaps he did not; but at any rate he gave her no encouragement to recommence operations upon his confiding nature. On the contrary, he ceased not to send in his little account very constantly once every 3 months, steadfastly refusing to give credit for any articles, however needful. After the sale of the Compton Basett property the bill was paid, but no farther accommodation in that quarter ever obtained. Indeed, the facility of selling out of the funds £100 a time as it was wanted, superseded the necessity of pressing for it, and in a little way Miss Martha and Mr. Smith had continued to deal most amicably, but always with a certain degree of mutual shyness. How delightfully different was the case now! Mrs. Barnaby had only to send her maid or her man boy to the redundant storehouse of Mr. Smith, and all that her heart best loved was sent for her inspection and choice, without the slightest doubt or scruple. Mr. Barnaby was proud of his wife, for if not quite as slender and delicate, she really looked very nearly as handsome as ever, a slight soupçon of rouge refreshing the brilliancy of her eyes, and concealing the incipient fading of her cheeks, while the total absence of mauvaise honte, an advantage which may be considered as the natural consequence of a 12 years' reign as the belle of a well-officered county town, enabled her to preside at his own supper parties, and fill the place of honour as bride at those of his neighbours, with an easy sprightliness of manner that he felt to be truly fascinating. In short, Mr. Barnaby was excessively fond of his lady, and as he was known to have made much more money than he had spent, as no bill had ever been sent to him without immediate payment following, and as Mrs. Barnaby's nature expanded itself in this enlarged sphere of action, and led her to disburse 5 times as much as Mr. Barnaby had ever expended without her, all the tradesmen in the town were excessively fond of her too. Wherever she went she was greeted with a smile; and instead of being obliged to stand in every shop, waiting till some one happened to be at leisure to ask her what she wanted to buy, her feathers and her frills were no sooner discovered to be approaching the counter, than as many right arms as were in presence thrust forward a seat towards her, while the well-pleased master himself invariably started forth to receive her commands. Any bride might have found matter for rejoicing in such a change, but few could have felt it so keenly as Mrs. Barnaby. She was, by nature, both proud and ambitious, and her personal vanity, though sufficiently strong within her to form rather a conspicuous feature in her character, was, in truth, only a sort of petted imp, that acted as an agent to assist in forwarding the hopes and wishes which her pride and ambition formed. This pride and ambition, however, were very essentially different from the qualities known by these names among minds of a loftier nature. The ambition, for instance, instead of being that last infirmity of noble mind, for which Milton seems to plead so feelingly, was, in truth, the first vice of a very mean one. Mrs. Barnaby burned with ambition to find herself in a situation that might authorize her giving herself the airs of a great lady; and her pride would have found all the gratification it sought, could she have been sure that her house and her dress would be daily cited among her acquaintance as more costly than their own. Mrs. Barnaby had, moreover, an esprit intrigant, in the most comprehensive sense of the phrase, for she would far rather have obtained any object she aimed at by means of her own manoeuvring, than by any simple concurrence of circumstances whatever; and this was perhaps the reason why, at the first moment, the proposals of Mr. Barnaby, whom she had, comparatively speaking, used no tricks to captivate, produced a less pleasurable effect upon her mind than a similar overture from any one of the innumerable military men whom she had so strenuously laboured to win, would have done. However, she was for this very reason happier than many other brides, for, in fact, she became daily more sensible of the substantial advantages she had obtained, and on the whole daily better pleased with her complaisant husband. As her temper, though quietly and steadily selfish, was neither sour nor violent, this state of connubial happiness might have continued long, had not some untoward accidents occurred to disturb it. The first of these was the sudden and dangerous illness of Mrs. Compton, which was of a nature to render it perfectly impossible for Mr. and Mrs. Barnaby to continue their delightful little parties at home and abroad. The dying lady ceased not to implore her daughter not to leave her, in accents so piteous, that Mr. Barnaby himself, notwithstanding his tender care for his lady's health, was the first to declare that she must remain with her. This heavy burden, however, did not inconvenience her long, for the seizure terminated in the death of the old lady about a week after its commencement. But even this, though acknowledged to be certainly a blessing and a happy release, could not restore the bride to the triumphant state of existence the illness of her mother had interrupted; for, in the first place, her deep mourning was by no means becoming to her, and she was perfectly aware of it; and her white satin and her silver fringe would be sure to turn yellow before she could wear them again. Besides, what was worse than all, a young attorney of Silverton married the daughter of a neighbouring clergyman, who, of course, was immediately installed in all the bride's honours, to the inexpressible mortification of Mrs. Barnaby. The annoyance which followed these vexations was, however, far more serious. The resources of poor Mr. Compton were completely exhausted. He had drawn out his last 100 from the funds, and actually remained possessed of no property whatever, except the nearly expired lease, and the worn-out furniture of the house in which he lived. Mrs. Barnaby listened to the feeble old man's statement of his desperate position with dismay. She knew just enough of his affairs to be aware that it was very likely to be true, though, with mistaken tenderness, her mother had always refrained from representing their embarrassments to her daughter as being of the hopeless extent which they really were. What then was to be done? The choice lay between two measures only, both deeply wounding to her pride. In the one case, she must leave the old man to be arrested in his bed for the price of the food which, for a few months longer perhaps, he might still get on credit. In the other, she must undergo the humiliation of informing her husband that all the gay external appearances she and her mother had so laboriously presented to the public eye, were in reality but so much cheatery and delusion, and that, if he would not take compassion on her father's destitute condition, the poor old man must either die in the county prison or the parish workhouse. The alternative offered more of doubt than of choice, and it might have been long ere she decided, had she not cleverly recollected that, if she decided upon leaving him to get on as he could for a few weeks longer, she must at last submit to her husband's knowing the real state of the case. She therefore resolutely determined that he should know it at once. The time she chose to make the disclosure was the hour when men are generally supposed to be in the most amiable frame of mind possible, namely, when hunger but not appetite has been satisfied, and digestion not fully begun. That is to say, Mr. Barnaby was enjoying his walnuts and his wine. "My dear Barnaby," she began, "I have some very disagreeable intelligence to communicate to you, which has reached me only to-day, and which has distressed me more than I can express." "Good heaven! What can you mean, my dear love?" "For God's sake, do not weep, my beautiful Martha, but tell me what it is, and trust to me for consolation." "And that indeed I must do, dearest Barnaby, for who else have I now to look to? My poor father, I had no idea of it till this morning. My poor father is dying, perhaps, my poor love. Alas! Martha, dearest, I have long known that his case was perfectly hopeless, and I had hoped that you had been aware of this also. But really, my love, his state of health is such as ought in a great degree to reconcile you to his loss. I am sure he must suffer a great deal at times." Mrs. Barnaby's first impulse was to reply that what she had to tell was a great deal worse than that; but this would have been the truth; and a sort of habitual, or it might indeed be called natural cautiousness, led her always to pause before she uttered anything that she had no motive for saying, excepting merely that it was true. and she generally found, upon reconsideration, that there was hardly anything which might not, according to her tactics, be improved by a little dressing up. So, in reply to this affectionate remonstrance from her husband, Mrs. Barnaby answered with a sob, " No, my dear Barnaby, I have no reason to doubt but that Providence will spare my sole remaining parent for some short time longer, if only to prove to him that his happy daughter has the will as well as the means to supply to him the exemplary wife he has lost. But, alas! dear Barnaby, who in this world can we expect to find perfect? My poor dear mother, in her great anxiety to spare his age and weakness the suffering such intelligence must occasion, most unwisely concealed from him and from me the failure of the merchant in whose hands he had deposited the sum for which he sold his patrimonial estate. His object in selling it was to increase his income, principally indeed for my poor mother's sake, and now the entire sum is lost to us for ever." " God bless me ! This is a sad stroke indeed, my dear. What is the name of the merchant? I hope at least that we may get some dividend out of him." " I really do not know his name, but I know that it is a New York merchant, and so I fear there is little or no chance of our ever recovering a penny." " Why, really, in that case, I will not flatter you with much hope on the subject. And what has the poor gentleman got to live upon, my dear Martha ?"" Nothing, Barnaby, absolutely nothing ; and unless your tender affection should induce you to permit his spending the little remnant of his days under our roof, I fear a prison will soon enclose him." A violent burst of weeping appeared to follow this avowal, and Mr. Barnaby, who was really a very kind-hearted man, hastened to console her by declaring that he was heartily glad he had a home to offer him. " So dry up your tears, my dear girl, and let me see you look gay and happy again," said he, " and depend upon it, we shall be able to make papa very comfortable here." The disagreeable business was over, and therefore Mrs. Barnaby did look gay and happy again. Moreover, she gave her husband a kiss, and said in a very consolatory accent, " The poor old man need not be in our way much, my dear Barnaby. I have been thinking that the little room behind the laundry may be made very comfortable for him without any expense at all. I shall only just have to "" No, no, Martha," interrupted the worthy Galen, " there is no need of packing the poor gentleman into that dismal little place. Let him have the room over the dining room. The south is always the best aspect for the old ; and besides, there is a closet that will serve to keep his pipes and tobacco, and his vials and his pill boxes out of sight." " You are most excessively kind, my dear Barnaby," replied his lady. " But did not you tell me that you meant to offer the Thompsons a bed when the bachelors' ball is given ? And I am sure you would not like to put them anywhere but in the south room." " I did say so, my dear, and I am sure I meant it at the time ; but a bed for the ball night is of so little consequence to them, and a warm comfortable room for your father is so important that, do you know, it would seem to me quite silly to bring the two into comparison." " Well, I am sure I can't thank you enough, and I will go the first thing to morrow to tell my father of your kindness." " I must pass by his house to night, my dear, in my way to the Kellys, and I will just step in and tell him how we have settled it." It was impossible even for Mrs. Barnaby to find at the moment any plausible reason for objecting to this good natured proposal ; but in truth it was far from agreeable to her. Her poor father was quite ignorant of the elegant turn she had given to the disagreeable fact of his having spent his last shilling, and she was by no means desirous that her kind hearted husband should enter upon any discussion of his misfortunes with him. But a moment's reflection sufficed to bring her ready wit into play again. And then she said, in addition to the applause she had already uttered, " By the by, my dear Barnaby, I am not quite sure that I can let you enjoy this pleasure without my sharing it with you. I know it will make my dear father so very happy." " Well then, Martha, put on your bonnet and cloak, and come along. It will be better you should go too, or I might linger with him too long to explain matters, and I really have no time to lose." The kindness thus manifested by the worthy Barnaby was not evanescent. It led him to see that the money produced by the sale of the little remnant of poor Mr. Compton's property, was immediately disposed of in the payment of such trifling debts as, despite his long waning credit, he had been able to contract ; and for the 2 years and 8 months that he continued struggling with advancing age and increasing disease, his attention to him was unremitting. During the whole of that time Miss Betsy Compton never saw him. All hope, and indeed all urgent want of assistance from her well-guarded purse having ended, Mrs. Barnaby's anger and hatred towards the spinster flourished unchecked by any motives of interest; and Miss Betsy was not a person to present herself uninvited at the house of a rich apothecary, who had the privilege of calling her aunt. She had indeed from time to time taken care to inform herself of the condition of her brother, and finding that he wanted for nothing, but was, on the contrary, very carefully nursed and attended, she settled the matter very easily with her conscience; and with the exception of the pension and other little expenses of Agnes, her income, yearly increasing, continued to roll up for no other purpose, as it should seem, than merely to afford her the satisfaction of knowing that she was about 10 times as rich as anybody, excepting perhaps Farmer Wright, believed her to be. When, however, the last hours of the old man were approaching, he told Mr. Barnaby that he should like to see both his sister and his grandchild; and 10 minutes had not passed after he said so, before an express was galloping towards Compton Basset with a civil gentlemanlike letter from the apothecary to Miss Betsy, informing her of the condition of her brother, and expressing the hospitable wish that she and the little Agnes would be pleased to make this house their home as long as the poor gentleman remained alive. Miss Betsy had some strong prejudices, but she had strong discernment too; and few old maids whose personal knowledge of the world has been as contracted as hers would have so instantly comprehended the good sense and the good feeling of the author of this short note as she did. Her answer was brief, but not so brief as to prevent the friendly feeling with which she wrote it from being perceptible; and ere they met, this stranger aunt and nephew were exceedingly well disposed to be civil to each other. Miss Betsy's arrangements were soon made. She wrote to the person to whose care she had entrusted Agnes, desiring her immediately to send her under proper protection to Silverton; and having done this, she set off in Farmer Wright's chaise cart to pay her first visit to her married niece, and her last to her dying brother. Chapters 5 and 6